Okay, I think that we are live. So hello everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on the proposed global minimum tax and its impact on free zones across the globe. My name is Jacopo De Toni. I am the editor of FDI Intelligence, the foreign investment monitor of the Financial Times in London. And more importantly, today I have the pleasure to be moderating this panel discussion. Really, kudos to the World Free Zones Organization for organizing a session on such a topical issue and involving three leading experts that will help us understand better how the global minimum tax will affect the competitiveness, if not the whole business model of free zones across the globe. You can already see them in your Zoom window. So let me introduce our speakers one by one and just get started with the discussion. I also encourage the audience to share questions with the panel throughout the session, and we'll try to field as many as possible throughout the session and certainly in the second half of it. So let me start with our first speaker joining from Colombia. We have Martin Ibarra Pardo, who is the founder and CEO of law firm Araujo, Ibarra and Asociados based in Bogota, and also serves as the vice chairperson, a legal expert at the World Free Zones Organization. Many of you in the industry already know Martin. He's an active promoter and advocate of free zones. He has advised international organizations and national governments on the setup of their free zones programs for decades. And he was also the founder of and former president of ASFA, the Association of Free Zones of the Americas. So welcome, Martin. Our next guest is joining us from the United States. Is Erik, Autor. He's the president of the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones in the US, which is the collective voice of the US Foreign Trade Zones program, which brings together more than 700 grantees, operators and user companies and industry service providers active within foreign trade zones in the US. Also, Erik has got loads of experience, decades of experience in working on international trade issues. And prior to assuming his current position, he was president of Autor Global Strategy, a consultancy company providing public policy, advocacy, regulatory and strategic communication services to business clients with a focus on international trade and investment. Last but certainly not least, joining from Dubai, another speaker with a very deep experience in international trade and development of free trade zones. We have Zoe Harries, who is a senior FDI and economic zones advisor. And Zoe is the managing director of a consultancy firm Impact Zones, and also serves as a project director at the World Free Zones Organization. Also, Zoe advises governments and international organizations around the world for the development of their free zones programs, with a particular focus on the competitiveness and sustainability of their free zones. That's really it. Thank you all for joining today. So, Martin, let me start with you. A study by NAFTZ a couple of years ago highlighted that almost 80% of free zones, special economic zones programs around the world offer fiscal incentives such as tax holidays or the application of a reduced tax rate. So how can free zone offering these types of fiscal incentives survive the proposal of a global minimum tax of 15%, long advocated by the OECD and now endorsed also by G7 and in the very foreseeable future also by G20?
Thank you, Jacobo. I am very pleased to be here and with the company of Erik and Zoe, and are a very good expert and very good friends. Well, the name free zone, free means free of taxes, and means free of procedures and mean free of restriction. It's in the name, it's in the ADN. But the question is what kind of taxes? And I want to underline that the free taxes are the international trade taxes. That is very important because, as you know, the merchandise and is the flows of merchandise between the different countries, the more than 200 countries around the world, are subject of custom taxes and VAT taxes usually. In some countries have more taxes. And the free zone are neutral spaces that allow the production, the logistics, and the redistribution of these goods and services. And if you put import taxes and VAT taxes over the zone, they are not free zone because it's against the name. That doesn't mean that other kind of taxes can be can be charged in the free zones. And if you see uh, the country with the most important free zone around the world, that are China and the United States, do not have income tax exemption in the free zones. For example, in China, and I have the opportunity to be in the team of the World Bank that created the first special economic zone in China in 1983 in Shenzhen. They maintain the allowance of exemption of income tax until 2008. And in 2008, they anticipate to G7. They grow the exemption, 5-year exemption of free zone. After 5 years of extension of free zone, they became 15%. And the Chinese company have to pay 33%. But in 2008, they unified the taxes of the free zone and the rest of China in 25%. And today, all the company in Chinese special economic zone and free zone have to pay 25% of income tax, corporate tax, unless they are high tech. The same in the United States. Here are Erik, and he's going to speak about that. But maybe the 500 foreign free zone between main free zone and subzones have to pay 21%. That is the corporate tax today in the United States. I mean, other countries like my country, Colombia, the free zone has to pay 20%. That is more or less the same OECD 23% average corporate taxes. That means, Jacobo, that the free zone can survive without the exemption of corporate tax. The important thing, the key aspect is that the government take, the whole government take around the free zone has international tax competitivity, international tax nivellation against the country that country, the host of the free zone, want to compete in the specific sector. For that reason, you have to choose what sector you want to compete and what are the other countries that are competing with you and what are the tax purpose that that country has. And the free zone can have, for example, if the country has the 30% of tax, maybe the free zone can have the 15% of tax. And that difference of 50 points for developing countries will be great, will be great. For that reason, I think the free zone around the world have to adapt to this new rule, and you have plenty examples. And the main important countries like the United States and China today charge corporate tax in the United States. But the last thing I want to underline is you have a big difference in taxes around the world, from 0 to 75%. In some countries, they have a 75% government take. For that reason, the business move around the globe. For that reason, the corporation has its base abroad. And now, Mr. Trump, when he reduced from 28 to 21% the corporate rate, they bring maybe $400 billion in reinvestment in the United States. For that reason, I think the free zone have to adapt to this new rule, and it's going to survive because maybe the 40% of the international trade around the globe are making around the free zoning production and logistic, but the essence, I underline again, is the free of import taxes and the free of VAT during the time that the goods are producing or the storage in the free zone.
Okay, fantastic, Martin. Already a lot of very, very, very critical points you raised there, and you mentioned a couple of times the example of the US. Erik, is a country that it's a foreign trade zone program has been increasingly successful over the year. As far as I know, as of 2018, there were about 195 free trade zones active across the country. And as Martin mentioned, no fiscal incentive in terms of corporate tax reduction is offered to companies operating within the zones, but it's mostly about customers incentives and cost savings when there are inverted tariffs opportunities. So do you want to give us a bit of a feeling of how you have been able to develop a successful free trade zones without offering corporate tax incentives?
Sure, thanks. And as you mentioned, you know, this proposal, if it does come to fruition, is unlikely to have any direct impact on the U.S. program because, as you mentioned, the benefits are mainly focused on duty benefits, duty-related benefits, and that has been successful. You mentioned the issue of inverted tariffs, and the industries that are most affected by inverted tariffs, such as automobiles and pharmaceuticals, have been where we've seen the most growth in the program. And most recently, the pharmaceutical industry, according to the latest statistics from the Department of Commerce, has seen significant growth in zone operations in the United States. The petroleum sector has dropped for reasons that are related to production, you know, with the growth of the U.S. Domestic petroleum production sector, that the industry has become less reliant on imported crude. So, so we do see that the benefits that are focused on those industries most affected by inverted tariffs have seen the most growth in the program. But again, because our program does not offer income tax incentives, this proposal from the OECD countries is unlikely to have any direct impact. To the extent that there are tax benefits that are offered to induce companies to start zone operations, those are done at the state level. And of course, state taxes would not be impacted by this agreement. So states, I would expect, would continue to offer tax incentives to attract investment into their states and more directly into the zones that they have in those states. And of course, those tax benefits are not limited just to companies going into foreign trade zones. So that is sort of a quick overview of what I see from the U.S. perspective on this proposal. But you know, the proposal itself is an interesting one because it really attempts to address one of the core underlying challenges over the many years in trade policy, and that is how to deal with the mobility of capital and the existence of countries that are essentially tax havens, you know, from the Cayman Islands to Ireland, and as technology has expanded, it has actually facilitated the mobility of capital. Of course, one of the other underlying challenges in trade policy is labor, which is not obviously as mobile as capital, and has created some real tensions in trade policy over quite a few years. As capital becomes more and more mobile, it has generated tremendous concerns from the taxing authorities on how do we restructure our tax policies to deal with that situation, both to deal with the loss of tax revenue and to tax companies that are operating in our country, and particularly in the tech sector. With the digital services tax, I think that tax issues, this has really brought the issue to a head in trade negotiations. But so it's a very interesting proposal to try to address these underlying tensions on the whole issue of the mobility of labor, of capital, and how to tax it. There are, however, I think, some potential really big hurdles that have to be crossed before this comes to fruition. Of course, the OECD is meeting on July 9th. The finance ministers from 20 countries are going to try to hash out the details of this proposal. And there are some questions. Number one is, of course, any deal that would be hashed out and any tax treaties that would have to be negotiated as a result by the United States would have to be approved by Congress. There are, significant differences in views on tax policy in Congress between Republicans and Democrats. I think that there are questions on, for instance, on what impact this would have on revenue, on tax revenue. That's very uncertain in the United States. And as you know, the Republican Congress passed the large tax bill in 2017 that reduced corporate taxes to 21%. If this were to be perceived as somehow jeopardizing the ability of the United States on how it levies taxes, that could raise some real concerns with Congress. So this proposal, I suspect, will not be easy to get through the U.S. Congress if it comes to an agreement. The other sort of potential fly in the ointment here is the European Commission, which is also proposing its own digital services tax globally in the European Union. And Congress would want any agreement to deal with the digital services tax disputes. And to the extent that there's uncertainty about that, particularly with respect to what the Commission seems to be proposing, could also complicate the approval of an agreement. Internally, the Europeans have a challenge as well, because they have countries like Germany and France that want fundamental tax reform, but smaller countries like Ireland, who I think are worried that this could adversely impact their competitiveness and ability to attract companies into their countries and their own economic growth. So the Europeans are going to have to deal with with some internal divisions over the details of what this might portend for the individual EU member countries. I mentioned revenue concerns. It's very unclear what impact this would have on tax revenue in the signatory countries. It's been argued that this provides greater predictability for companies, and for taxing authorities, which has its own benefit, but it's very unclear what sort of tax revenue impact this would have if it were to be approved, and also what impact it would have on the ability of countries to use tax policy as a way to attract countries to invest in their countries. And finally, there are a lot of details that could be thorny that need to be worked out. Would this be a binding agreement? In other words, that countries would have no flexibility to lower the rate below 15%. And if there are disputes, how those disputes between countries would be resolved. So those are a couple of big details that would need to be at least discussed on July the 7th. So those I think are some of the big obstacles and questions that I think remain for what otherwise is a rather interesting approach to dealing with this fundamental issue that's dogged trade policy and tax policy for quite a long time.
Okay, thank you, Erik. I think again, it makes a lot of sense, the fact that we also have to highlight all these hurdles that still kind of like imperil the implementation of this reform proposal. It is obviously has been discussed for a long time. It's been endorsed now by G7 and likely, as I mentioned, also by G20 very soon, but not necessarily any country would agree to it. And particularly, I guess, while the business case for a country for big economies like the US and China and the European Union may be pretty clear, there are many countries in the developing world that are competing also through fiscal incentives. And I guess that there are many concerns to be addressed on that end of the negotiation table. And I want to tie this in with bringing in our Zoe. Zoe, I know that you work with several governments also in the developing economy sphere, and actually at the moment also currently you are working with some of them to develop their own free zone programs. So how do you expect this reform proposal at this stage to be affecting the design of future free zones?
Thank you very much, Jacopo, and also for the kind invitation to join this panel. I'm delighted to be part of it. So yes, we are speaking with various governments, as well as zones authorities, as well as zones. And our findings are that the main concern is more about what investors are looking for in terms of infrastructure development, services, than about the taxation. So also what Martin Ibarra already pointed out, it's not all about the corporate income tax, but we're also looking at the ease of doing business. So reduced regulatory challenges or bottlenecks through the zones, as well as foreign ownership and repatriation of revenues and of profits. So the competitiveness angle based on purely on corporate taxation is, in my view, not going to really be a huge game changer for the free zones. It definitely is a wake-up call, but most zones have already realized, as well as governments, that in order to remain competitive moving forward in future, more will be needed to enhance the competitiveness than just the incentives package. And this is already a development that has been going on for several years. So what is most important is that we look at global value chains, especially also what's changed now recently in the wake of COVID-19, knowing that companies right now are looking more to diversify their supply chains, to create more resilience and to secure their supply chains. That is a major concern, more than the corporate taxation at this moment. So this is what we are seeing. And the zones and the governments are very concerned about being able to offer the companies what they need in terms of infrastructure, so both in digital infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure, as well as the services which they are offering. So this is currently what we are dealing with. And also with regards to speaking with the governments, we're looking very much at sector and cluster development and what needs to be updated within their regulatory framework for special economic zones, enabling them to attract these kind of companies to be able to either start new sectors and clusters in a country where there hadn't been those sectors before, or to further build sectors which are already strong in that area and have the opportunity to grow further. Furthermore, so this is more looking at a sector point of view, but I think also in terms of trade and logistics, with the radically changing landscape of cross-border trade and investment, we see the zones, the free trade zones. So looking at port zones with large hubs, that they are very much concerned about other corridors opening, what's happening to global value chains, how can we anticipate these changes, and how can we remain competitive? Also with looking at nearshoring, reshoring, and regionalization.
I guess that this proposal happens right at the moment where, as you're pointing out, there are so many different moving parts, so many developments also affecting free zones already. As you mentioned, the restructuring and the reshaping a bit of global value chains in the wake of the pandemic, bigger push for nearshoring or reshoring altogether, manufacturing activity closer to customers. So I guess, do you expect a follow-up question? Do you expect that at least in a transition phase, was this reform to be implemented in a transition phase? There will be also some element of investment reallocation by the multinational corporation affected eventually by this reform.
Mm. Absolutely. So my philosophy is always, with this change, there's opportunity. So definitely companies will be changing their organizational structures and their shifting operations. They've already been doing that in the wake of COVID-19. This adds the minimum global taxation will add an extra dimension. It depends very much on the business model of the company. So as has already been mentioned, it depends very much on the jurisdictions where they are already operating. So it will affect the one jurisdiction more than the other, depending on the level of taxation which is already there. And as Erik already mentioned, in the US, the zones have already been competing without playing the corporate taxation card, if you can call it like that. So we're going to definitely see shifts, and zones can anticipate these shifts by reviewing their value proposition. So what are the incentives they are offering? What are the areas in which they're targeting companies? So it's very important to understand the full supply chain of the companies they are targeting or already hosting, and also anticipating what the companies already located in the zone might be considering in terms of shifting operations elsewhere. So it's key for the zones to fully understand the full supply chain of, first of all, the existing investors or companies, as well as their targeted investors and companies, and understand the taxation within those jurisdictions within the full supply chain.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Zoe. Martin, let me get back to you. This is a reform that, as we have already pointed out, tries to address this long-standing problem of profit and fiscal revenue erosions, and has been discussed by countries at OECD level for many years. But to some extent, the idea of a global minimum tax for me sounds, if I may be a bit provocative, too good to be true, in a way that I see so many implementation hurdles, and also when it comes to free zones. For example, I wonder what is going to happen if we were to implement this reform, this 15% global minimum tax rate what is going to happen to all the companies that are operating within free zone on the basis of, on the basis of a contract that states that they don't have to pay any corporate tax, because that was part of their setup, the incentive that they were offered. And this is probably just one of very many implementation hurdles that I can imagine, but you are a law expert, you are a free zone expert. So how do you see this really be implemented, and how do you see some of these hurdles being addressed?
Okay, thank you, Jacobo. Well, we saw a very similar situation when the WTO was launched 25 years ago. They changed the incentive to export, and they changed the incentive to free zones too. They forbid the new WTO that replaced GATT, forbidden absolutely to condition the income tax for exports. And the most of the country has to remove the export commitments of its legislation. And of course, there was a transition period. But today, the more than 150 countries, almost 200 countries that are members of the WTO has to follow that order. And I think two ideas, Jacobo. The first is transition time. Of course, as Erik said before, there will be a transition time, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, depending on the developing of the country. Because the tax incentives is the same like the handicap in golf. The less the country is, the more handicap has. For that reason, maybe in the same way that the WTO was approved, they give allowance of time depending of the developing of the country and the income of the country. And the second is, as I said, each country, each free zone has to see what other taxes are around the free zone. For example, the municipality tax is not covered for this regulation. The property tax is not covered for this regulation. The wealthy tax, that is terrible, because when you charge a wealthy tax to the company or to one investor, this tax is not compensated in another country, because if you raise the corporate tax, because the most of the corporation has a global taxation system, when you pay in this country, you reduce that tax in the main country. But if you have a wealthy tax, you don't have any country to compensate this tax. And I think, as I said before, the country has to think in another way to be competitive. If you don't can run, maybe you can make bicycles. you can change the strategy, or you can play chess. And I think this is the new rules of the world. The same 20 years ago we changed the rule of international trade, and now the OECD and the G7 are trying to move the rule of the taxation. But I think if all the countries have the same rules, we have to compete in different strategies.
Right. And a follow-up question. I guess you are also familiar with the specifics of these negotiations. Do you see that there is still room for things like allowances on investment on physical equipment, for example, or on research and development to still be in place even after the implementation of a global minimum tax?
Absolutely. For example, if you invest in a free zone, that equipment do not have to pay any tax in the free zone. No import tax, no VAT tax, and maybe there will be an allowance, but general allowance, not in the corporate tax, in the deductibility of the investment of the corporate tax. And maybe there will be some provision for less developing regions, because, for example, one excellent example is the Vietnam free zone legislation. If you want to set up a free zone in the capital, you have certain level of taxes. But if you want to set up a free zone in a very far poor city, the taxes will be dramatically low. The same we have in the new legislation in Colombia, that you can reduce your commitment of employment and investment depending of the level of income of the region. And I think in Costa Rica it's the same. If you are going to set up the free zone in near the capital, you have certain years of allowance. If you are going to be in remote zone, they have to have 50% of more tax allowance in the. I think there are a lot of room to play with all these circumstances.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you, Martin. Erik, another one for you, also picking up on something that you have already mentioned. So the US now, the Biden administration is still trying to push to raise corporate tax to 28%. So if they manage to get that through Congress, then the divide, the gap between this national corporate tax and the global minimum tax will be pretty substantial, and it totally reverse what was the tax cut that you mentioned from the Trump administration. So to some extent, do you expect this to have any impact on activities of foreign trade zones in the US? And also going back to what you mentioned about like other type of incentives at other levels of government, to what extent these additional incentives can in a way substitute a more general reduction of corporate tax at the free zone level?
Right. Well, it's a real open question whether Biden is going to be able to get his tax proposal through Congress. But you know, if the corporate tax rate does rise to 28%, that will have a broader impact, not specific to FTZs, on corporate investment generally. But one other initiative of the Biden administration that could have a significant impact on the zone system is the whole strategic supply chain issues, you know, to try to move supply chains in critical industries such as batteries and pharmaceuticals and so forth back to the United States. And you know, to the extent that that is happening and will continue to happen, I think that this clearly represents an opportunity for the U.S. Zones program, because companies that will be seeking to reshore operations to the United States are going to be looking for the types of incentives that are available in the zone system. So, so that's an interesting aspect of what we're seeing from the Biden administration and its impact on the zone system.
Okay, and this is also very interesting. I guess that we are seeing a lot of investment trends that probably were had less momentum before the pandemic, and now they gain much more momentum. You mentioned batteries. Definitely, we're seeing a lot of reallocation of investment by major automotive producers and battery producers. A big push towards electric vehicles, and this probably also be opportunity for anyone in investment promotion, including free zones. We have a few questions. Zoe, maybe this is for you, going back to the idea of what can be the impact on developing countries. And this is a question specifically on what could be the impact of a global minimum tax on emerging regional economic zones agreements like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And also, I guess, going back to something that Martin mentioned, would you expect do you think that there is room for some regions to be exempt or anyway to be given more leeway, more room to maneuver their fiscal levers to continue in their kind of like developing curve?
Okay, so This is a very interesting question. We've been speaking with the African Continental Free Trade Area, and their objective is to double intracontinental trade within the next 15 years. Because with compared to the US and the EU, the intracontinental trade is at an extremely low level in Africa, for example, at 18%. So that has to come up to 36% in 2035. And therefore, they have been seeking our advice on how zones could boost intracontinental trade. So, and then we looked at the challenges being faced. So the major challenges are a lack of harmonization between the countries, and what is scaring companies off of investing in Africa, for example, is the difference in requirements of, for instance, the certificate of origin. So there's no harmonization of the certificates of origin. And why am I highlighting this away from speaking about the corporate minimum corporate taxation? Is because there are other concerns which I would consider are more pressing or more urgent than just the corporate tax rate alone. So there's a lot of work to be done within the continent of Africa to streamline processes. So on the more on the regulatory level, we are looking at major challenges. And in my opinion, the minimum tax rate would actually be beneficial for the African countries because it would contribute to their harmonization, making the landscape more level playing field in that sense, in terms of taxation, enabling them to focus on the other discrepancies which are there, with the other bottlenecks which need to be overcome in order to bring the intracontinental trade up to the level which they want to see. So we're looking at establishing cross-border free zones, and we're supporting governments in creating cross-border free zones, like we have, for instance, also between Nepal and China, and harmonization of corporate taxation would only facilitate this process, in my view.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you, Zoe, also for this. And I guess, yeah, this go back again to the whole concept that there is more to fiscal incentives when it comes to the success of free zones, and we are also seeing like the emergence of when it comes to jurisdiction or regulatory environment zones that are offering even like a total independent jurisdictional environment, like it is happening with the Dubai International Financial Center, which is being emulated by other countries with independent court, independent arbitration court. So, and you know, those examples, I guess, even though they tend to cater mostly to the financial sector, but still they tell that there are elements belonging to the ease of business, of doing business, that probably are from the perspective of attracting investment are even more important than the single fiscal investments. Okay, we got another few questions now. I think an interesting one that makes sense, also considering other development in the free zone area, is how to manage fair competition between companies within the zones and without the zones. And I guess that I would say that probably like a follow-up question would be why, if we were to go ahead again with this global minimum tax, why a global multinational corporation should decide to locate within a specific area labeled as a free zone rather than going anywhere else in that specific geography. Maybe Martin and Erik, you want to share a couple of views on this?
Thank you, Jacobo. Yes, this is a very usual question, especially for local companies that said, I cannot compete with my competition, of the same cluster than it in the free zone because they have a different tax regulation and procedure regulation. But it's not true. It's not true because that company maybe can set up a branch in the free zone. If the legislation is open, all the people have the right to go there. But in the other hand, Jacobo, you have to pay to be in the free zone. In some countries, you have to pay in investment requirements, or you have to pay in employment requirements, or you have to pay in internationalization process. And in the other hands, the free zone is not for all the companies. The free zone is for those companies who need free environment for the value added change. Because when the World Trade Organization was settled, was launched, they created the concept made in the world. And that made in the world, that means a product needs a lot of input and raw material for different countries. And this raw material has to be duty-free. If you put duty and procedure over the inputs and raw material, you broke the global change and you broke the concept of made in the world. For that reason, there are some goods and services that only are made in or from a free zone. For example, airplane has 100,000 parts, and I am sure that maybe that the different part of an airplane is made in several free zones around the world. Or if you see garments, the 70% of the garments are made in the free zone in China, in Vietnam, in Dominican Republic, or in Colombia. The call centers, if you receive a call from a call center, maybe that call center, you have 80% of possibilities that are in the free zone or the cloud free zone for storage data. For that reason, I think it's a fair competition in the way that any company has the right to be in one of the 3,500 free zones that are around the globe.
Okay, fantastic.
Right.
Thanks, Martin. Erik.
Yeah, and I think Martin said pretty much what I was going to say as well. You know, we are constantly having to counter the misperception in this country among some policymakers that the zones program here offers some kind of unfair benefit to companies that locate in zones and is hurts companies in the US that are not in the zones. But our response is the zones program is open to everybody. And if a company finds that its competitor is getting an advantage that they don't have by being in a zone, then the answer is simple: set up a zone operation yourself. There is an upfront cost, but the cost savings over time will more than make up for that. You know, smaller companies obviously don't necessarily have the financial resources to be able to incur those upfront costs easily, but quite frankly, that points to a bigger competitive disadvantage that they may have you know, being cost competitive in the U.S. market against other companies, whether or not they're located in a zone. So, you know, the zone system is open to everybody and offers benefits beyond just duties. You know, things like weekly entry, being able to consolidate your entries, being able to store merchandise in a zone duty-free until you withdraw it for consumption in the US, getting duty-free treatment for your exports. All of those things are valuable benefits that any company can realize by locating in a zone.
Okay, thank you, Erik, also for this answer. We have time for another couple of questions. I think this question goes back to something that we have already discussed, but probably approaches it from a more kind of like macro perspective. Wouldn't this global tax contribute to a wider gap between rich and poor countries? And if I can rephrase it, is it really feasible to expect that some of the developing countries that have been able to attract investment through generous fiscal incentive, is it really feasible to expect that they can transition to a better regulatory environment, better infrastructure environment right away without losing in the transition some of the investment that they have been able to attract? Zoe, Martin, or Erik, anyone that can want to take it?
I'm happy to answer this. So to summarize your question, Jacopo, you're asking whether the global minimum taxation would be a risk to the competitiveness of the least developed countries.
Or like, obviously it is a risk, but to what extent it is feasible to expect that those countries that have been able to attract investment make up for some of their competitiveness weaknesses through fiscal incentives, can now transition to make their business environment a better business environment, can now transition to focusing on improving their infrastructure without losing some of their investment that was there, particularly because of fiscal incentives along the way.
Yeah, good question. I don't think there's just one answer to that question because of the considerations for companies to locate in such countries are very diverse. It also depends very much on the sector. So also, like Martin mentioned, are we speaking about BPO activities like shared service center? Are we speaking about manufacturing? So it depends very much, because like for BPO services, the digital infrastructure is crucial, but also the geographic location, looking in time zones, as well as the availability of labor. So looking at the skills, the language skills, and maybe if they're ICT services or financial services, are these skills available? And ultimately, these skills are crucial for example, BPO activities. So this is also, again, a consideration besides the tax incentives, because you can offer really attractive tax incentives, but if you can't find the labor you need to be able to operate your business, straight away you have an issue. Furthermore, looking at, for example, resource considerations. So a lot of companies have located in less developed countries, being closer to their resources in basically shortening their supply chain. So instead of importing their goods to wherever their original production facility was, they've moved production closer to where they can find their resources, and at the same time benefiting from the incentives package which is offered by the zone. And I think in this sense also the corporate taxation is less of a critical factor, and looking more at import tariffs and VAT benefits and advantages. So there's not just one straight answer for this. I hope this clarified the issue.
Okay, thanks, Zoe. Yes, Martin.
Yes, I want to add the Zoe answer, because I want to underline the concept that the free zone is much more than a corporate tax exemption or reduction. It's a whole concept of competitivity, of mental competitivity. Here are in the strategic of the competition, to be competitive. And many years ago, I attended an invitation of the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones. And a person made a wonderful speech about what will be the minimum advantage percentage of cost reduction that a company will be oriented to be into the foreign trade zone in this case. And the answer was 3%. In that conference, if the free zone is 3% more competitive in cost reduction, international trade, or in local taxes, or in environment, or in reverse tax, the company will go there. And I have a lot of examples of developing countries with full exemption that has empty free zone. But I have another hundreds of examples of countries that do not have any corporate reduction of exemption, and ours has a very successful parks and free zones. It's not a direct relationship. For that reason, Jacobo, the free zone is a lot more than a corporate exemption or reduction strategy.
Totally. And if we had with us some representative of the private sector, he would definitely tell us that at the end of the story, the return on investment is what is they're all looking at, and not necessarily. And obviously, fiscal incentives are just like an element of many different elements they are considering. Erik.
Right. Just to follow on some points that Zoe made, I think individual countries are going to have to look at the wide variety of factors that impact their competitiveness and focus on things where they can make a strong case for investment, and it goes beyond just tax incentives, as she mentioned. There are a whole variety of things. I mean, I think of in Africa of Senegal and the port at Dakar. It has very comparatively close proximity to both the European and the North American and South American markets. So that is something that the Senegalese could definitely, impacts their competitiveness. So there are a whole variety of factors, but I'm wondering to what extent that this proposal might facilitate tax reform in developing countries, many of whom still rely heavily on import duties for government revenue, and whether this might help them reform their tax systems and to focus more on a European or developed country model on corporate income tax and VAT, rather than significantly relying on import duties as a source of government revenue. So that's an interesting point. And if they can make up, if actually imposing a 15% income rate on companies is still significantly below where other countries are setting their corporate rates, that might actually in the long run help them, combined with tax reform.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Erik, also for these comments. We have 2 minutes left, so I would ask you a very final question that kind of like brings everything together, and it really boils down to what are your personal expectations. I would just encourage you to be concise, but at the end of the story, this is a reform that is still on the table, has not been approved, and has not been widely approved, just been endorsed by some of the biggest economies in the world, but this doesn't necessarily mean that it will be globally implemented anytime soon. So my question, a two-pronged question, do you expect a global minimum tax rate to be widely agreed anytime soon? And the follow-up question would be, what is the timeline that you have in mind for a possible implementation of a global minimum corporate tax? Martin, I see you on my screen, so I put you on the spot right away. What are your expectations? You're still on mute.
My expectation is yes, I am very close to OECD, and maybe the time frame will be between 5 to 10 years. And the developing countries and the other countries has to use these 40% of gap, as Erik said, that has between the 15% and the 24% that are the average OECD corporate income tax.
Okay, that's fantastic, very clear. Zoe.
My expectation will be that I agree with Martin with the timeline, that the implementation will be 5 to 10 years. Some countries or zones already have the flat tax rate of 15%. For instance, Mauritius, I believe it might have changed, but it used to be 15%. And this will set an example for harmonization of global corporate income tax. I think increasing fairness in terms of competitiveness. So it's going to actually spark competitiveness in a more fair way, both on the governmental level, on the national level, but also on the zone level, and also for the companies operating within the zone. So I think in terms of governance, best practice, we're looking at a much healthier, more sustainable landscape, and creating a future economy in which the zones will play a very important role in transcending the challenges which we are currently facing, and moving into a new era and a new economy in which ESG profiles are going to be more important and creating prosperity for all.
Okay, thank you, Zoe. Erik, you have the final say on this.
Just quickly, as I said, we don't expect that the proposal would have a direct impact on the U.S. zones system. I think I'd like to see what happens in the OECD meeting on July 7th. I think we may get a clearer picture on what the process looks like going forward and the time frame. I do think it is, that there are some significant obstacles to get over to reach a final agreement on this, the ones that I mentioned. So I hesitate to speculate on a time frame. It is going to be not a short period. And the OECD countries coming together on a proposal like this with a plan for implementation, I think will set the stage for other countries as well to come on board to a more global agreement.
Okay, that's great. And if I may add, I also probably share a more cautious view like Erik, and I'm also very curious to see what will be the reaction, the position of a country that are traditionally not necessarily aligned with US interests. Like, if you're thinking that I mean China, yes, I do mean China, and a few others that are not necessarily just political powerhouses, but now they're also becoming investment powerhouses. So we will see also what will be their position. I guess that on this will some of the success, the degree of success and failure of the initiative will also hinge on what will be the position of countries like China, Russia, etc. But guys, thank you very much. It's been a very fascinating conversation on a very fascinating topic. So thank you again, Zoe, Harries, Martin, Ibarra, and Erik, Autor, and thank you very much to World Free Zones Organization for organizing this session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jacopo. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Thank you.
Bye.